When an empath finally reaches the point of going quiet and withdrawing from the world, it is not a random mood shift or a sudden emotional shutdown. It is the result of a nervous system pushed to its absolute threshold. Empaths do not merely experience emotions, they absorb them, metabolize them, and often carry the emotional burdens of others without even realizing it. And after an extended period of narcissistic abuse, their psychological defenses become drained in a way that feels almost cellular. The body keeps score, and eventually, the empath's inner world demands repair. What makes this stage deeply misunderstood is that people assume silence equals weakness, avoidance, or emotional fragility. But in truth, this silence is a biological necessity. The constant hypervigilance created by a narcissist, never knowing when the next accusation, manipulation, or emotional ambush is coming, keeps the empath in a prolonged state of adrenaline and cortisol. Over time, the mind stops fighting, not out of defeat, but out of preservation. The empath withdraws because every external stimulus feels like an emotional intrusion, even the harmless ones. They retreat because, for the first time, their body refuses to negotiate with chaos. This withdrawal often surprises the narcissist because it signals a break in the cycle. Empaths are known for their resilience, compassion, and willingness to understand others. But what most people overlook is that this same sensitivity becomes the reason they must step back so forcefully. When their nervous system reaches burnout, staying home is the only place where their boundaries are respected. At home, they are no longer required to decode someone's intentions, anticipate emotional volatility, or suppress their own truth to maintain peace. They can breathe without calculating. And this silence, though quiet on the outside, is incredibly loud on the inside. It is where the empath begins sorting through the emotional debris left behind. It is where they finally differentiate between what belonged to them and what was projected onto them. This internal reorganization is not a passive act. It is a rebuilding process. And like all reconstruction, it requires space, solitude, and the absence of psychological predators. So when an empath goes silent, it is not a sign of collapse. It is the first true sign of awakening. It is the moment their system refuses to carry what was never theirs. And the most powerful truth is this: silence is not disappearance, silence is rebirth. One of the most misunderstood reasons empaths go silent is that they finally recognize the psychological architecture behind the narcissist's behavior. They begin to see the patterns with a clarity that feels almost unsettling. The gaslighting that once confused them now appears structured. The guilt tripping they used to internalize becomes transparent. The emotional chaos that once made them question their own sanity reveals itself as a calculated strategy designed to exhaust their sense of self. And when an empath reaches this level of awareness, silence becomes their only honest response. You see, empaths don't withdraw because they have nothing left to say. They withdraw because they have nothing left to explain. They understand that communication with a narcissist is not real communication. It is a performance, a negotiation, a constant reshaping of truth to avoid conflict or deflect blame. Every conversation becomes a battlefield where logic is distorted and intentions are twisted. The empath eventually recognizes that the narcissist is not interested in understanding, They are only interested in control. And with this realization, the empath stops participating. This silence is not passive. It's a form of psychological liberation. When an empath goes quiet, they are reclaiming the mental territory the narcissist invaded. It is the moment they stop defending themselves against accusations built from projection. It is the moment they stop trying to justify emotions the narcissist never intended to respect. Silence becomes a shield, simple, clean, impenetrable. It protects them from the manipulative loops that once consumed so much of their emotional bandwidth. Staying home intensifies this protection. Distance creates clarity, and clarity creates detachment. In that detachment, the empath begins to see how much of their life was shaped by the narcissist's needs, moods, and insecurities. They see how often they apologized for things that were not their responsibility. They see how often they softened their truth to avoid another emotional ambush. And with this awareness comes a profound shift. The empath no longer feels obligated to participate in their own manipulation. By going silent, the empath is not abandoning the relationship. They are abandoning the illusion. They are choosing truth over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over emotional entanglement. And once that choice is made, the cycle breaks. In the end, the most powerful thing an empath can say to a narcissist is nothing at all. There comes a moment in an empath's healing journey when the outside world begins to feel overwhelmingly loud, even when nothing is happening. After enduring the unpredictability of narcissistic behavior, where calmness can instantly turn into conflict, and affection can suddenly transform into accusation, the empath's sense of safety becomes fractured. They start to realize that the only environment where they can fully exhale is the one they control. And so they stay home, not because they are hiding, but because home becomes the one place where their nervous system finally stops bracing for impact. Home becomes more than four walls. It becomes a psychological sanctuary. There, no one is reading their empathy as a weakness. No one is taking advantage of their patience, twisting their words, or weaponizing their kindness. Within their own space, they are no longer required to perform emotional labor, anticipate someone else's mood, or shrink themselves to avoid triggering a narcissist's fragile ego. Silence inside their home feels different, less like loneliness and more like relief. What makes this phase so powerful is that the empath begins to notice how much of their life was spent in emotional vigilance. They recall the countless small hesitations, the pause before speaking, the careful phrasing to avoid misunderstandings, the constant scanning of the narcissist's expressions to predict what version of them would appear next. At home, these micro survival strategies fall away. The empath begins to experience what psychological safety actually feels like, not as a concept, but as a lived reality. This safety creates space for introspection, not the self-blame they were conditioned into, but genuine inner exploration. They begin asking the questions they never had time or clarity to ask. What do I want? What do I feel? What do I believe? These questions seem simple, yet they are transformative because a narcissist's influence often clouds an empath's sense of identity. Home becomes the quiet ground where those answers slowly rise back to the surface. The empath's solitude is not avoidance, it is reconstruction. It is the mind slowly returning to itself after being pulled in too many directions for too long. And when they finally understand this, they realize that staying home is not a retreat from life, it is a return to self. In the end, the place they feared losing becomes the place that saves them, and the truth becomes undeniable. The space where you feel safe is the space where you finally begin to heal. One of the most profound reasons an empath retreats into silence is that they are, often for the first time in their adult life, learning who they are without the influence of the narcissist's shadow. Narcissistic abuse doesn't simply wound emotions, it distorts identity. It reshapes the way an empath sees themselves, not by force, but through subtle, persistent psychological erosion. Over time, the empath begins to mistake the narcissist's projections for truth. They start believing they are too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, or too difficult, when in reality, these labels were never reflections of who they were, only reflections of what the narcissist needed them to believe. When the empath finally steps back and the noise fades, something remarkable happens. The silence becomes a mirror, a clear one, and in that mirror, they begin to recognize the outlines of a self that had been buried under years of emotional adaptation. They start to see how much of their behavior was shaped by survival, softening their voice, suppressing their anger, accommodating unreasonable expectations, apologizing for boundaries that should never have required justification. In solitude, they begin disentangling their authentic identity from the identity the narcissist constructed for them. This process is not glamorous. It is slow, uncomfortable, and deeply introspective. But it is also liberating. The empath begins to rediscover simple truths about themselves, their preferences, their values, their emotional rhythms. They reconnect with passions they abandoned because the narcissist minimized them. They rediscover strengths they forgot they had because they spent so long being told they were not enough. In a way, they start rebuilding the internal architecture of their personality, brick by brick, with honesty instead of fear. Staying home becomes less about isolation and more about alignment. It is the only environment where they can explore these rediscovered pieces without interference. They don't have to justify their emotions or walk on eggshells. They don't have to negotiate their worth. In the quiet, they begin forming a new internal boundary, not the rigid wall of a wounded person, but the firm, healthy boundary of someone who finally knows themselves. This is why the empath's silence is so often misunderstood. It's not a void, it's a rebirth. It's the sacred space where the empath meets themselves again, without distortion, without manipulation, without fear. And the revelation is simple. You cannot be yourself until you stop living inside someone else's version of you. There comes a turning point in every empath's journey where they finally understand something they were never taught. Their energy is not infinite, and it is not owed to anyone. This realization often arrives only after a long period of depletion, after the narcissist has drained their emotional reserves through constant demands, emotional volatility, and the silent expectation that the empath will always be available. For years, the empath gives without limits because generosity feels natural to them. They assume others value harmony the way they do. They assume that empathy is reciprocal. But when they step into silence, they begin to see the truth with unsettling clarity. Not everyone who takes from them ever intended to give back. This shift is not merely emotional, it is psychological. It marks the moment the empath recognizes that their attention, their compassion, and their emotional labor are forms of power. And like any form of power, it must be distributed wisely. Narcissists condition empaths to believe that withholding energy is selfish, that setting limits is cruel, and that pulling back is a sign of weakness or emotional immaturity. But in silence, the empath sees how distorted that narrative was. They begin to understand that giving endlessly is not love. It is self-erasure. The realization that their energy is precious becomes a kind of inner awakening. They stop offering explanations to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop trying to soothe the egos that thrive on conflict. They stop pouring emotional nourishment into relationships that only grow thorns in return. Instead, they begin forming a new internal compass, one guided not by guilt or obligation, but by alignment and authenticity. In the quiet of their home, they start noticing subtle shifts. They no longer feel compelled to answer every message instantly. They no longer tolerate emotional chaos disguised as passion. They no longer feel responsible for fixing people who refuse to take responsibility for themselves. Their energy becomes selective, intentional, and guarded, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. This is why empaths stay home. It is the one place where they can protect the currency of their spirit without apology. Being alone teaches them that their presence is valuable, that their peace is sacred, and that their empathy is a gift, not a resource for others to exploit. And the truth they carry forward is simple but life-changing. When you learn the worth of your energy, you stop spending it on those who profit from your pain. When an empath finally goes silent, it marks a psychological shift that is far more significant than most people realize. For the narcissist, silence often registers as surrender, a sign that the empath has fallen back into compliance. But this time, the silence carries a different weight. It is the moment the empath stops reacting, stops defending, and stops feeding the emotional ecosystem the narcissist depends on. This is not silence born of fear. It is silence born of clarity. It is a form of inner emancipation, where the empath recognizes that disengagement is not avoidance, but liberation. What makes this stage so powerful is that the empath is no longer trying to win, convince, or repair anything. They have stepped outside the psychological battlefield entirely. Their silence is not a tactic, it is a state of being. It marks the split between the self that tolerated emotional chaos and the self that refuses to be defined by it. In a Jungian sense, this is the moment the empath integrates the shadow, the part of themselves that once feared conflict, abandonment, or disappointment. Now, that shadow becomes strength. It becomes discernment. It becomes the quiet confidence that no longer needs validation. When the empath stays home, they aren't hiding from the world. They're detaching from the narcissist's gravitational pull. The empath realizes they don't need to announce their boundaries, argue their truth, or justify their absence. Silence becomes the boundary. Distance becomes the message. And the most telling part is that in this stage, the empath is no longer waiting for an apology, a breakthrough, or a moment of self-realization. awareness from the narcissist. They've accepted that the narcissist's understanding is not required for their healing. This silence is the empath's first authentic act of self-loyalty. For the first time in the entire dynamic, they choose themselves without guilt, without negotiation, and without bending. The narcissist loses access to their emotional energy, and in doing so, loses control. The cycle breaks not through confrontation, but through absence, through stillness, through the empath's refusal to participate in a script they did not write. This is the moment the empath steps out of the role they were cast into and steps back into themselves. And the truth becomes undeniable. The silence of a healed empath is louder than the chaos of a narcissist. Because in the end, the strongest thing you can ever say to someone who tried to own your peace is simply this: nothing.